Hey, so Jacob and I had an opportunity to just sit down and allow him to kind of ask some questions. One of the questions that he asked me, which I thought was a pretty good one, was, "Hey, if I've been in the business 22 years, what would I do if I was getting ready to retire?" So we decided to have that conversation on camera, and here you go. Check it out.
So, Rich, if you were, as a financial advisor of 22 plus years, going to retire tomorrow, what are some steps that you would take to make sure you are positioned for success?
I think it's a pretty interesting question, right? Because um, if I was going to retire, I hope that I wouldn't be making decisions the day before, right? A lot of the times, I think when you're looking at retirement, realistically, a lot of the planning and steps you might take should be started probably at least 5 years in advance. Everything from initially saying, "Hey, do we have enough? Are we at the right levels of assets? When are we going to take Social Security? Um, you know, do we have any pension income or do we have real estate? How are we going to handle that real estate in retirement? What does my tax planning look like from transitioning from maybe full-time work or being self-employed to retirement? If my situation, I would have a company, right? So am I going to sell my company or how am I going to exit that company and what are the tax consequences of those things? So there's a lot of moving parts and going from a transition of like being a fully employed or working person to fully retired, there's a lot of consideration rather than just kind of pulling the pin and hoping that everything kind of works out,
Duck and
right?
cover,
Like,
sure.
oh, like let's just hope it works. So, I mean, that's the first thing is basically listing all of my income sources, everything that I need to divest myself of. How are we going to do that? I would definitely involve my professionals. I think even though I've been in the business for over 22 years, I don't know everything, and so I would have my attorney, my CPA, and some other specialists that I would say are important to me that I get advice from, and we'd be sitting down in a group and we'd be talking about it, and just making sure that we've crossed every T, we've dotted every I. That's another kind of really important thing, because the worst thing in the world you want to do is like, oh well, I didn't think about that, and all of a sudden you've got a big tax hit, or maybe you thought you had an income stream that maybe isn't quite as strong as you thought it was, right? So having a really clear picture of what you're dealing with and starting on that in advance, I think, is key. The second thing I think that my opinion has really changed a lot. I would say in the last 4 years of retirement planning, and that is, I think ever since COVID, uh, a lot of people would say the world has changed a little bit, and what I mean by that is historically speaking, when you look at markets and what you think investments inside of markets can give you, what you could plan on inside of retirement, we have this historical data, right? And we think that the average of the stock market or bond markets or different indexes have given us this. And so we can kind of use that, quote unquote, as like a ballpark. This is what we can plan on. But I think the part that is a little bit enlightening or maybe disturbing to me is that starting in 2020 with COVID 19, that started a series of economic, I want to say like dominoes, if you will. And the beginning of it was realistically man made. And I'm not referring to whether or not you believe the virus was created in a lab or whether it came from a bat or anything like
Yeah,
that. I'm
you
not
hear a
talking,
hundred things, wherever
right.
it came from.
It doesn't matter where it came from, right? I think the part that as an advisor that kind of threw a curveball is it was a man made decision to shut down the economy
It's,
of the world,
it's terrifying.
right? Like it wasn't just like, oh, well, we've got this small area, maybe a city or something, we're going to quarantine this. It was the entire world, and the markets of the entire world tumbled. And it wasn't a natural thing. It wasn't because of supply and demand. It wasn't because of, economic factors. It was, we're going to tell people who can go to work and who can't go to work. And then, of course, that was for a brief period of time, quote unquote. But even now, we're still feeling a lot of the reactions from that, because then after everybody goes back to work, then you've got supply chain issues and you've got all this congestion built up, and the market recovers. But then all of a sudden, you had all this stimulus money that was another man-made decision, right? We're going to dump money into the economy. We're going to give this group of people money, but not this people. These businesses we're going to give loans to that don't need
Loans,
to be repaid,
grants,
right?
extra funding.
Yeah, and we're not talking small dollar amounts here. We're talking very large. And the second that money was printed, I mean, a lot of us were like, inflation's coming, and there's nothing you can do about it. You print that much money and put it into the system, there has to be inflation. So then we have a recovery, And then 2022 happens because we have so much inflation coming into the economy because there was so much money created that they jack interest rates super hard in order to control it, right? So that causes not only a recession, but long-term effects from high interest rates because they've got to slow the growth or the inflation down in the economy. So the end result, which is a little bit, I think, out of the box and is concerning to me, is you have two major recessions in a 3-year window, which is completely not normal.
Yeah.
And all of it was man-made decisions. It was, we're going to do this. We're going to raise interest rates. We're going to dump money in the economy. We're going to shut down the economy. And I think that is, and I think I speak for a lot of people, I think that that's something that all of us feel like, hey, this was not normal, right? Is it the new normal? We don't know. Like, okay, so did we learn from this? And the next time, the next version of some virus comes out, and whether that's COVID version 24.7 or some other strange virus that comes out, are they going to shut down the economy again?
Yeah. Are they going to give investors whiplash for the 37th time? Like,
Yeah. Or did we learn from this? Because if in fact it's in the new playbook for whoever the powers might be that are making these decisions, and again, you could kind of get into a whole tangent about who that is and what, but the reality is that now that there is this different element involved, I would not have a plan without guarantees in place. And what I mean by that is I would make sure that I have streams of income coming in sufficient to meet my needs that cannot be taken away by some human decision.
external decision.
At least as much as you could limit it, right? Because I suppose that you could say if someone's going to go crazy with their power or their decisions, right? Like, and if they would have kept this shut down longer, the consequences could have been even worse. But I mean, it has so many tentacles that goes out. If you have rental real estate and you are a landlord, and all of a sudden you've got tenants that can't pay their rent, and you can't kick them out, and all of a sudden you're sitting on real estate that you might be making a mortgage payment on,
And you're not getting any income from.
yeah, and you may not qualify for one of these unforgivable loans and things like that. So, for me, I think after that experience, I would never want to go into quote unquote retirement without really stress testing my portfolio and saying, okay, like, and that's something we do normally for economic cycles, right? Like, okay, I want to make sure that I can retire if the market goes up, if the market goes down, with historical data, and we stress test that. But now I want to look at it in a different aspect and say, if we have another COVID attack,
If we see another 2 recessions in 3 years or something
Yeah.
similar to that.
how is my portfolio going to behave? Can I pare back and weather the storm, right? Or how's it all going to work out? And I think that that's like a real game changer. I think a lot of the clients that we work with and people I talk to, everybody kind of has that feeling in the back of their mind. They're just saying, hey, like, this is something that we've never seen before, realistically, right? Like, you can go back and you can see different outbreaks of viruses, everything from World War I and the different types of the flu or fevers that go throughout, right? And it had devastating effects as far as the death toll, but we've never ever seen, to my knowledge, a situation where we all, whether we were in agreement to do it or whether the people at the top, you decided to do it, but we decided to close down the economy.
Yeah, someone pulled a circuit breaker and it changed. It changed how we view economic planning. It's crazy.
Yeah, and so, for me, I think that's a very long way to answer a short question, but I would be looking at that if I was to retire and say, hey, like, if that were to happen again, how long of a storm could I weather without, really having to kind of dig deep or pull way back to the point where I'm uncomfortable, right?
Right.
That would be definitely, I think.
Well, it makes sense, right, to have a tool in your toolbox to deal with the situation. You've seen it in the past. We figured out how to deal with it then. Let's keep that tool in the toolbox so that in the future, I know how to deal with that. I've got this portion set aside.
Yeah, and I think as advisors, and it's something that we all learn from, right? If you would have told me in 2018, hey, Rich, there's a virus coming, right? And it's going to come from China, and it's going to act like the flu, but yet people are going to be so scared they're going to close down the economy, and you're going to be told you can or cannot leave your house, and they're going to decide who can go to work and who can't. I would have laughed at you. But I don't laugh about that anymore because it happened. And it happened in a very short period of time, right?
Yeah.
And so, like, what else is in the future? Well, we can't plan for things we don't know, but definitely I think that's something that we could try to simulate on a portfolio and say, hey, like, how am I, ready for this? And so, definitely, I would have guarantees in place that could weather, the storms that we felt like were reasonable to expect. I think a lot of the other things that starts the planning 5 years in advance is I would have a tax plan. The way that you take Social Security, the way that you're taking income in retirement, and I'd be meeting with my CPA before I ever got close to pulling the trigger and saying, hey, let's run some mock tax returns. Let's see what retirement looks like for you, because chances are in retirement, a lot of the deductions, like if I'm a business owner, I have a lot of business deductions to offset income. In retirement, if I sold my company, quote unquote, and again, there's another taxable event, um, how am I going to handle that? Am I actually going to be in a higher tax bracket if I'm retired than when I'm working? If I am, maybe there's some things that I can do as far as how I'm taking income or how I'm retired, quote unquote, right? Just to minimize that amount of tax and maximize my living income. Because the reality is that, if we're on a fixed income in retirement, right, and you want as much flexibility as you can because you want to have lifestyle, you want to have things that you want to do, but if somebody could save, and I'm just throw out random numbers, $5,000-$10,000 a year in taxes by doing proper planning, well, that's a lot of wiggle room that it gives you to either have a better lifestyle or maybe even allow you to pull less on your investment portfolio if you needed to, right? So tax planning, I think, is another big point that should be done well before you retire, rather than just saying, well, I'm retiring tomorrow and I'm going to have less income, so therefore I've got to pay less tax, right? And that's
Well, and
not always the case.
I think at the same point, talking to people, talking to clients, they're all worried about it. They're all, what is tax going to look like in retirement? It's like, don't leave that up to chance. Be proactive about it. Take steps now to see what it's going to look like and know what it's going to look like.
Yeah, and I think that politically speaking, there's always that kind of nefarious idea out there that, oh, well, if this administration gets in or this party takes control, maybe we'll get tax cuts, or maybe they're going to raise taxes and all these types of things. And there's elements of it that you can't control. But what you can say is, hey, I know for a fact that if I pull income from this source and this source or use this type of a program, I'm going to have less tax liability regardless of where the brackets are at, right? Now, sure, they can go in behind the scenes and maybe change the required minimum distribution rates, or they can change different deductions, what you're allowed to take, and those types of things. But there are big parts of your plan that you can very much, interpret and say, well, yeah, if we pull income from here and I have, these tax benefits, regardless of who's in office, it's going to put me in a better position than not doing it at all, right?
So there's tax planning, there's a guarantee, there's proactive planning. What other elements would you throw into a retirement plan if you were to go tomorrow? Hopefully not tomorrow. If
Hopefully
you were
not tomorrow,
5
right?
years
Yeah.
from now, what would you start doing?
There's so many aspects to it. Like for me anyway, I mean, if you got those things laid out, right, there's also, for me, there's estate planning. That happens well before you retire, hopefully, right? But a lot of people sometimes don't even think about it until they retire, because we all assume that we're young. If we're working, we're still young, quote unquote. And when you're retired, then all of a sudden you're old, and that's not necessarily the case. But the estate plan is so integrated into everything that you're doing, from the way that you're titling assets, and if something were to happen to you, I always call it being promoted to glory. Are things going to go the way that you want them to? If one spouse predeceases the other spouse, that's a huge deal, right? Because if you're making retirement decisions and you're trying to decide maybe on Social Security planning, or maybe you have a pension, or maybe you have income coming from an annuity, and you have to decide, am I going to take the absolute most income I can, and then if I die, my spouse gets zero? Or do you take that option where, hey, if I die, my spouse gets to keep the same amount of income or a reduced amount? Those are decisions that are made, again, well in advance, right?
Should be made well.
Should be real in advance, but sometimes they're made haphazardly, right? Like some people actually just talk to their HR director at work and they say, hey, what do you think I should do? And it's not even part of kind of like the really big picture, right? So I think those are aspects that all go into kind of that type of planning. The other thing that is I think a bigger reality more than ever is, and it's not fun type of planning, but I think it's something that sometimes you have to have hard conversations with yourself and your spouse. But hey, what happens if it's not a death? What happens if it's just we lose lifestyle because of health, right? If we aren't able to have that happy-go-lucky lifestyle where we're skipping down the beach every single day of our retirement, what happens with increased medical costs? What happens if one of us needs assisted living? How would we handle that type of thing? And it's not that you have to say, oh, well, this is going to happen and this is what I'm going to do. But again, throw a dart at the dartboard and say, what if?
Yeah. What are ways you can stress test that now?
Yeah, like, okay, let's take a look at where we have income, where we have assets. If all of a sudden one of us had increased medical costs, or we had had to go into an assisted living place, something like that, can we handle it? And sometimes that involves maybe not only conversations between you and your spouse, but maybe potentially family members, and just saying, hey, look, this is our plan, just so you guys know. And so if something were to happen to us, we've thought this through. And communicating that to people who are important in your financial world and making sure that those things can happen. I think that if you kind of you can never, like, I think, stress test every possible scenario.
Life's too unpredictable for that.
Right. I mean, there's that thing, the old saying that man plans and God laughs, right? So, but I think there are certain, I think, major types of decisions where you could plan ahead and say, you know what, if this happens, then here's my plan. And if that happens, great. And we always liken it to fencing. I mean, fencing's big in my family, and but you always say, if my opponent does this, then I will do that. Retirement's really not that much different, in that, hey, if this curveball comes to me and we go into recession, if we have high inflation, what is my plan? What am I going to do if my health fails? If one of us passes away, God forbid? Like, I have options in my wheelhouse that I can use, and I feel at least confident moving forward. And I think what I found that is when you have those elements in financial planning, all of a sudden you're able to enjoy retirement more. Because I see several things, right? Like, I see clients that kind of do, I don't know if it comes across wrong, right? But the ostrich philosophy. I'm just going to stick my head on the ground and hope things go well. But what I found is that a lot of times those people may not, for example, they may not really enjoy retirement because they're so worried about those things in the back of their head. They don't want to really confront it, right? So we just leave them and they fester back here, and then they say, well, we don't really know if we can take those cruises or we can do those vacations because we might need to save our money in case XYZ happens, right? Well, if you've already thought about it and you say, no, well, I already know what I'm going to do if that happens because, I've got this asset or I got that asset or our income is enough to cover that, those types of things.
It's kind of like taking a road trip without a map.
Yeah, in a way, right?
Like you can figure it out, but I don't think it's going to be fun.
No, most of the time it's not. And sometimes you cause yourself grief, right? Like sometimes you go past the exit and you got to flip around and you realize you passed it 50 miles ago, right? Or, you think, oh, I'll just let Siri or whoever the person is on your phone guide you, and then you realize wherever you're at, you don't have data.
Yeah.
So I just think that the more that you can kind of have a good rounded plan that has those elements, estate, tax, asset planning, and the way that they all integrate together, I think that just allows you to say, hey, we thought about that stuff. We hope that 90% of it never happens, right? We hope that we make it to age 90 and then we pass away in our sleep together, me and my spouse, and that
same time, good to go.
Right, and everything's
Take
happy.
the same elevator to heaven.
But I would say most of the time that doesn't happen. So I think that if you have at least a well-rounded roadmap, you can handle those things. And I mean, quite frankly, a lot of times plans end up better than you thought, right? It's not necessarily like a negative thing. Planning isn't a negative thing. It's just being prudent in looking forward and saying, hey, this is how we're going to handle it, right? So I think those are kind of maybe the major things that I would take a look at. And every single one of those, there's a lot of decisions, right? But at the end of the day, you and your spouse are on the same page. Probably in a lot of situations, the kids at least understand a general idea of what the plan is. I've got people in place where I need them. My professionals all understand what my intentions are, and we're working together, and they're working with each other, so that you just have the best probability of success, right?
So it sounds like I know that there's a lot of hard conversations that have to happen to make it easier later.
Yeah.
And being afraid of hard conversations is just going to make it harder.
Most of the time, I think that's definitely true, right? I think hard conversations are something that none of us like, but I think that there's a different way to approach it, right? Like, there are hard conversations to have that people run away from because something bad has happened and you've got to confront it. And retirement shouldn't be viewed that way. Retirement to me it's a blank canvas, and you say to you and your spouse, hey, this is a new phase of life. We've worked our tails off for the last 40, 50 years. The time has come for us to enjoy. And the conversations we're about to have are, let's paint this picture together, right? And sure, we need to plan for things that may be unexpected. We hope they don't happen. But if they do, then the picture just becomes that much better because we've already thought about it. And so I look at it in a very optimistic point of view. Same with estate planning. Like, estate planning to me is exciting. And a lot of people dread it, right? Like, I'll be honest, I think one of the hardest questions that me and my wife has ever had is that, hey, if something happens to us, who's going to raise our kids, right? And she's looking at my family and I'm looking at her family, and that's like a really hard conversation to have. But so sometimes talking about death, people view that as that. But the reality is that I view estate planning as this is your chance to build your legacy, right? You've worked your tail off. Hopefully you've enjoyed your retirement. You've had good health. You get promoted to glory. You go to the other side. And now, what do you want your legacy to be? Some people just, hey, I want to give it to my kids and they can do whatever they want with it. Fantastic. Like, if that's what you want, then let's make it happen, right? But then I think that there's other times where you say, hey, no, like, I want to be more value driven. I want my kids to understand, hey, I worked my tail off because I had a really strong belief in work ethic, or I believe that we're here on this earth to accomplish things and not just to float aimlessly around, to be blown away by, whichever wind takes you, right? And you want to transition that to your kids. And so, or grandkids even. And I think that an estate plan, when it's properly done, that's exactly what it does. Is there are ways and mechanisms and tools that you can instill in your kids and your family those values, and you have the option to benefit their lives in ways that really are
more than money,
right? Like, even monetarily, if you do it right? And again, if it's your values and your desires, like, you can actually say, hey, look, I'm going to pay for, education. I'm going to pay for maybe religious things. I'm going to pay for these types of things because I want to instill that in you. And that can have a payoff for generations upon generations that are kind of unforeseeable, right? Like, so it's exciting. It's really kind of cool. So I think all aspects of planning are exciting in the same way. It's a blank canvas, and we shouldn't be looking at this as like, hey, like, I don't want to talk about this uncomfortable stuff. I mean, it's a canvas. And so, like, even like the most negative one, I think, in planning, which also incorporates itself into the topic at hand that we're talking about, is life insurance planning, right? Like, nobody wants to say, hey, if I get hit by a car tomorrow,
right,
what's my family going to do?
It's not a fun question.
No, it sucks, right? But the reality is if I have a blank canvas, and the way I look at it is I've got kind of two choices. I could say, well, the reality is if something happens to me, my family can just figure it out, right? And that picture does not look as rosy as, hey, I've got a life insurance policy. It's sufficient in size to make sure that my wife doesn't need to stress out, remarry,
sell a bunch of assets,
like all that kind of stuff. Like, she can do what she needs to do, and
of course it's going to suck. Of course it's going to be different. It's never going to be the same, but there are things you can do now in order to soften the blow. You know what I mean?
And again, like that picture of somebody who receives a life insurance death benefit is completely different, and I would say much brighter than families that I've sat down with who didn't have life insurance, right? And all of a sudden it's like, hey, we can't even make the mortgage next month. How are we going to pay for a funeral that's like $12,000, right? As compared to families that say, no, it's okay, like, this sucks, we're going to go through the grieving process, but at least we don't have to worry about XYZ, right? So I think if the whole mindset of just saying, hey, like, I want to paint this picture for the people I love and I care about, and life insurance in the conversation that we're talking about, that's something I hope I never use. I hope I throw away all my premium that I put in my life insurance.
Thank goodness.
Right?
Happy to do it.
Happy to do it. Same thing with my food storage or whatever else you might have in your life. There are certain things that you pay for that you hope to God that you never actually use it.
Right.
And that would be one of them.
Life insurance, car insurance, most insurance.
Yeah, exactly. And then, like, if you do need it, and same thing with any insurance, right? Then it's there for you. But in any regard, I think that you just need to look at planning and saying, hey, this is actually a really positive conversation that we're going to have from a mental standpoint. Let's talk about it. Yeah. And just that little twist, like 10 degrees really changes the way that I think people talk about hard topics, because it's no longer just, having those horrible conversations. What if, and you're trying to stress test something or come up with every possible horrible scenario you can come up with. That's not really planning, right?
That's a bright day. That's a fun day.
Yeah, no, it should be, hey, if we manage these types of risks, then we can change our focus to all the beautiful parts of retirement planning.
If those boxes have been checked, I don't have to worry about them. I know they're good.
Yeah. Then
What's next?
Let's go have fun.
Let's go to
right?
Cabo.
Right. And we can, because we know we can afford it, right? So that's kind of a very, I guess, long answer to a short question, but I think that they're really important to understand, and to understand like when it actually starts, right? If you're already tired, sometimes it starts now. Like maybe you've already pulled the retirement trigger, but having a plan, whether it's now or later, is always better than not having one.
And when's the last time you reviewed it? If you're in retirement, well, I set up a plan 10 years ago, we're good to go. Well, like you said, administrations change, tax laws change. When's the last time you took a look at it? Crack open the books, let's sit down and figure out what's wrong, what's happening, if there is anything wrong.
Yeah, and I would say, obviously we're large proponents of reviewing things all the time, but there's everything from very small changes that maybe you don't think are big changes, right? Like we sold a car and bought another one. Okay, well, how is it titled, right? Does it need to be titled differently than it is? Or anything from health insurance. Which supplemental plan are you using for prescriptions and for those types of things? Now you're on a different med. Should you change parts of your health type planning? There's also very large changes. Maybe one of my kids has predeceased me. That's a horrible situation, but does that affect your estate plan? Absolutely it does. Maybe one of my kids is going through a horrible divorce and we feel like we need to look out for that particular child, right? Those types of things I think are always necessary to go back to the plan and say, okay, does it affect it? If so, how much, right? And then sometimes it's, hey, we're okay. Not a big deal. Everything's fine. Great. That's the best thing in the world, because then you can go back and you can like focus on the problem that you need to deal with, right? I remember one story that I had is I got a phone call at 7 a.m. on a Monday morning from a client, which is not really common, right? And we had sorted out their plan exactly like I was telling you, and all the professionals were working together. And I got this call, and they said, hey, something really bad has happened in the family. We're scared to death. We think the whole plan might be blowing up because of this thing that happened. I said, give me the details. What are we dealing with? And they had told me that, a member of their family had made a horrible decision. We can kind of leave it at that, right? But one of those things that you say to yourself, I hope my kids never do X, Y, Z. Well, right. It happened.
Chance is never zero.
Right. And so I said, tell you what, let me call the attorneys, everybody that we need to call. I'll get back with you as soon as I can. I picked up the phone. We knew exactly what professionals were involved in the plan. We knew where everything was. We made a couple of phone calls, and within 2 hours, I was back on the phone. I said, everything's fine. Hey, if you like what you see or you want some additional information, go to our website listed here below, wheelhousewealth.com. Get in touch with us. We'd love to answer any questions you might have.
So, Rich, to sum up everything that we've been talking about, the initial question was, what are steps you would take to, put a retirement plan in place tomorrow? Sounds like have a good team of professionals. Make sure you have a solid plan in place. You know where you're going to be. Don't leave it up to chance. And what else?
Well, yeah. So not only do you have a strong team of professionals, they're talking to each other, right? You've got a good plan in place with those professionals. You've stress tested it. You've looked at the fairly realistic, things that could happen, and you're comfortable with the strategies that you have in place. You've done your tax planning, estate planning, and your transition planning from whatever your work is, your business that you own, whatever, and they all line up. And as you mentioned before, that could be 5 years, it could be more, it could be less, but the key is just having all those elements inside of a plan that can allow you to take that first step into your transition to retirement with confidence.
Sure. So it sounds like proactivity, being smart, being communicative with all of your professionals is a really big part of the plan, and a really big part of what you would do as a financial advisor of 22 plus years in order to have a successful and stress-free retirement.
Yeah, I think so. And I think one thing that you mentioned that is key, right, is being really open with your financial professionals. Because, sometimes, whether it be a CPA, a financial advisor, an attorney, or an insurance specialist, whoever it might be, if if you're like guarding information as far as like maybe, hey, I'm kind of worried about my health. I don't want to tell anybody that I've got a heart condition, or like, I don't want to tell anybody that I've got, a crazy sister, and whatever the case may be, right? Like, the advice that you're going to get is worse.
Right.
And so you kind of have to open yourself up a little bit. Be very open about, hey, I'm worried about this. I'm worried about that. Could be everything from politics. What keeps you up at night? But if your professionals know that of what it is that's keeping you up at night, I think that the type of plan they can put together for you is going to be 10 times better than kind of walking in and being like, oh well, I have this much in my 401k. What can I do with it? Like, no, we need to talk about a lot more than that.
Let's
Right?
talk about who you are, what your goals are, what your family goals are. Like, it's different. It changes everything.
Changes everything. Yeah.
Sure.